Hello Internet. There is a rather annoying trend that I have noticed of everyone blaming so-called corporate greed for rising inflation. Inflation is hated quite a lot since it is the rise in the general level of prices, or as some in the comment section might retort, an expansion of the money supply. But I see that as more of a possible cause. Regardless, inflation has been a thorny issue for the whole world, including America. As I said in my last video, since 2021, monthly inflation in the States has ranged from 2.6% to 9.1%, and the annual inflation rate back in 2022 was a whopping 8.3%. It has been cooling down to roughly 3% for the last few months, but that is still too high. One way of viewing inflation is by considering it the difference between an economy's overall supply and its overall demand. If demand exceeds supply, in general you will get higher prices and hence inflation. If the gap between demand and supply is high, then there is high inflation. If consumers get more money, demand rises so the gap rises, increasing inflation. If certain resources are damaged, supply falls so the gap rises, increasing inflation. Keep this in mind for later on. In response to all of this, American President Joe Biden has been espousing certain inflation myths by unjustly blaming corporations. He has in fact spread a lot of misinformation on economics, which had led me to create this video as my second in a series where I debunk Joe Biden's economic arguments and policies, Debunking Bidenomics. And this time he had decided to tackle the concept of shrinkflation on the Sunday of the American Super Bowl.
The Super Bowl Sunday. If you're anything like me, you like to be surrounded by a snack or two while watching the big game. You know, when buying snacks for the game, you might have noticed one thing. Sports drinks bottles are smaller. A bag of chips has fewer chips, but they're still charging it just as much. And as an ice cream lover, what makes me the most angry is that ice cream cartons have actually shrunk in size, but not in price. I've had enough of what they call shrinkflation. It's a ripoff. Some companies are trying to pull a fast one by shrinking the products little by little and hoping you won't notice. Give me a break. The American public is tired of being played for suckers. I'm calling on companies to put a stop to this. Let's make sure businesses do the right thing now.
In economics, shrinkflation is defined as, quote, the practice of reducing the size or quantity of a product while the price of the product remains the same or slightly increases. In some cases, the term may indicate lowering the quality of a product or its ingredients while the price remains the same. The absolute price of the product doesn't go up, but the price per unit or volume has increased. It has been commonly used by producers to deal with inflation problems from suppliers. But this is a weird scapegoat, since shrinkflation is virtually the same as normal inflation. Where supply decreases, but demand is kept the same, and hence the gap between supply and demand increases, which represents higher inflation. A company increasing prices doesn't necessarily mean they are at fault, since they can be responding to high costs, and decreasing the size of your product can save resources for the economy. But what do Biden and many progressives mean when they say corporate greed? Good question. But before we answer that, let's understand three key definitions. A monopoly is when there is only one seller in a market, so can charge a higher price to consumers since there is no competition. But these days, the term is colloquially used as a shorthand for a few sellers in a market, which can still have a similar effect since there is still less competition. Marginal cost is the cost of producing an additional unit of a product within a business. So if it took $10 for a baker to produce another pizza, then the marginal cost is $10. Now, variable cost is a cost that rises when output rises. This would be similar to the $10 to make the pizza in the baker example. But marginal costs take into account both fixed costs and variable costs, where fixed costs are costs that are there regardless of how much you produce, like your monthly rent or costs to regularly maintain a piece of machinery. Due to the similarities of marginal and variable costs, they can be used as estimates of each other for some studies that we will look at. So what do they mean by corporate greed? I'll let Robert Reich, a rather staunch progressive and proponent of the greedflation argument, explain. He claimed that companies/monopolies are exploiting their market power to raise prices. In 2020, in his testimony to Congress, he stated, quote, when corporations are so flush with cash, why are they raising prices? They're not raising prices solely because of the increasing costs of supplies and components and of labor. Corporations enjoying record profits in a healthy, competitive economy would absorb these costs. Why? Because they can. and they can because they don't face meaningful competition. So when President Biden is complaining about corporate greed, he is talking about corporate monopoly power. But are these high prices actually linked with monopoly power? Well, to check this, we can analyze the link between prices and profits. Inflation is directly affected by the growth of the markup, which is the ratio between the price a firm charges and the marginal cost of production. In other words, inflation is the sum of the growth in the marginal cost and the growth in the markup. Markups can rise due to greater consumer demand or a rise in monopoly power of companies. But here's the thing, markups may or may not contribute to inflation. In a monopoly, if demand rises, then markups for a monopolist rises, but if marginal costs rise, then markups fall. Three lovely researchers from the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City decided to verify the claim of whether the rising inflation within America was due to monopolies preying upon excess consumer demand. They used CompuStat data, which is very helpful as it shows costs of goods sold for publicly traded corporations within the US. This is a rough estimate of total variable costs. It also allows them to estimate the markups at a firm level and create averages for different sectors. Marginal costs for individual firms are not available, so the researchers used variable cost as a substitute measurement instead. Now, inflation was 5.8% in 2021. And this is interesting because, according to the researchers, they discovered that markups rose by 3.4%. That means markups made up most of the inflation in 2021, or 58.6%. So is Biden right that inflation is due to corporate profits and corporate greed? That monopolies have allowed these fat cats to get away with ginormous profits? Maybe we should be riding with Biden. Well, personally, I would rather consider choking on a pointy needle before supporting Biden, and I apologize for my bigoted fat shaming of affluent cats. They have kittens to feed. But Biden is not necessarily right that we have this massive inflation because of corporate greed. Businesses may expect higher costs to replace current inventory as it is sold, or that future marginal costs will increase and slowly raise prices to smoothly keep up with these costs rather than raise them abruptly. You see, the markups and the inflation don't coincide properly. In the first quarter of 2021, estimated markups rose the highest by 16%, while inflation only rose by 4.6%. Yet in the second half of 2021, markups fell while inflation accelerated. This suggests that inflation was not due to market power. Well, I guess Biden is somewhat wrong when he says that companies are trying to pull a fast one on the consumer. Maybe corporations aren't the problem here, slow Joe?
America is a nation that can be defined in a single word. I was going to put him in
We can still further analyze the argument that monopolists would take advantage of high demand to raise prices and hence drive markup growth. And so then we would expect industries with high demand to have higher markups. We already see different demands for different goods and services, such as 7% inflation for durable goods, 7.4% for non-durable goods, and 4.3% for services. But when checking for the estimated markups for their comparable industries, they were 2.9%, 2.2%, and 0.33%. As in, markup growths were quite similar for industries despite drastically different inflation rates. If you guys are enjoying this video so far, please give a like as it really helps the video, and subscribe for more content. The researchers also created a model that follows a monetary policy rule where the central banks raise interest rates in response to higher inflation. In this model, firms realize that inflation will rise by 10% per year, and then fall slowly and return to normal prices within 2 years. In anticipation of this, firms raise prices, which leads to great markup growth and inflation. But due to the high inflation, the central bank will raise interest rates, and this will lead to lower marginal costs at first. But once marginal costs rise, they're cut into markups. In this model, markups are initially higher than inflation, so the blue line on this graph that is represented by markups is above the green line, which represents inflation. But after marginal costs rise at point 0 in this graph, eventually inflation is higher than markups. Also, markups begin to shrink. This model simulation is quite similar to the quarterly pattern of inflation and markup growth in 2021. The initial markup-driven rise in inflation foreshadows the rise in marginal costs later on, and persistent inflation. So this further reinforces the idea that the data with 2021 is most likely due to companies predicting that their costs will rise so that they will increase prices to keep up with future inflation. I guess President Biden is really coping right now. Or maybe he's asking, "Where am I?" to his aide in the White House. Another group of researchers from the American Economics Association also wanted to investigate any connection between corporate greed and inflation by using price changes via industry codes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and compared them with markups. Similarly, they also estimated markups from CompuStat data through the revenue and costs of publicly traded firms, as well as from a markup method found in a 2020 study. They checked comparisons between markups and prices in two periods, one from 1980 to 2018 and another from 2018 to 2020. They created two scatter plots comparing both price changes and mark changes for both periods. R-squared is a measure of what extent the data is explained by a variable. The R-squared value for the period 1980 to 2018 was 0.0009. while the R-squared value for the period 2018 to 2022 was 0.00003. Pretty low values. After all, there is not a strong correlation between prices and markups, especially as the line of best fit is flat or nearly flat. So overall, there is no correlation between markup rises and price rises, no correlation between monopolies and sectors with higher price rises, and that inflation is more due to higher inflation expectations than greedy corporations. Companies aren't benefiting profit-wise from high prices because the inflation is probably also eating up their profits via costs. I was directed to one of these studies by a rather informative video on inflation, responding to Robert Reich by a channel called Political Checkmate. I would love to talk about that video, but I'll save it for another time. In the meantime, you can check out his video in the pinned comment below and see some of his other amazing content debunking leftists and their talking points. And right now at least, he uploads pretty frequently compared to say me or Stephen Michael Davis, so don't forget to subscribe to him. If you enjoyed this video and like me dunking on Biden, then another reason to subscribe to my channel is my series called Debunking Bidenomics. I've already debunked Joe's landmark policy, the Inflation Reduction Act, where it was projected to most likely not reduce inflation at all. Feel free to watch it if you haven't already. Anyways, thanks for watching, like, comment, subscribe, and see you later. Bye.